Andrew from SACS. Welcome to video number 3 in our 11 video series on toxic behaviours at work. This one is about cognitive ability, IQ, aptitudes, whatever you want to call it, intelligence and toxic behaviour. So we're really addressing the question of whether cognitive ability can affect the degree to which we see negative and positive behaviours at work. And the answer is yes, there is a relationship between negative behaviours and cognitive ability. And so let me show you some research that demonstrates this. The first study that we want to show you is from the link between cognitive ability in prisoners. So this research was undertaken by Bree Diamond and colleagues in the United States of America. Now, if you go to jail into the States, it may surprise you to know that in many places they actually psych test you. You know, they might measure your cognitive ability, in other words, give you an IQ test, an intelligence test. They might test your personality, and they retain those records. Bree Diamond got access to those records, and what she identified was that certain jail cells were low IQ, medium IQ, or high IQ, largely due to pure fluke. In other words, if you get a certain bunch of prisoners together, if you get enough of them randomized across all different jail cells, then by pure luck you'll end up with high IQ jail cells, low IQ jail cells, and medium IQ jail cells. And so the prisoners in there, on average, when you average their cognitive ability, that was low, medium, or high. And what she discovered is that the rates of violence corresponded quite closely to the levels of cognitive ability. So the degree to which they were likely to beat each other up was increased if the level of cognitive ability in that cell block was lower. So this is one of the big and important studies in a really practical setting, jail after all, about what determined levels of cognitive ability. But that's not the only evidence about the relationship between cognitive ability and violence or toxic behaviours. Work populations around the world, and this is the work of Denise Ones, the famous researcher into negative behaviours across the world, she found a 0.35 correlation between cognitive ability and negative behaviours in employees generally. So counterproductive work behaviours as they're known. So the counterproductive work behaviours which apply in a workplace are really of two types. Bad stuff against your colleagues or bad stuff against the organisation. And what she found was that this correlated 0.35, which is not an inconsequential correlation in big samples, with cognitive ability. So if you've got a low IQ workforce, then it's much more likely that you'll see negative behaviours out of that workforce. The next one is about a thing called the Flynn effect. Now, the idea of the Flynn effect, this was discovered by a scientist by the name of Flynn from New Zealand, a cognitive ability theorist, if you want to put it that way. He noticed that cognitive ability was improving over the years. Now, so if you looked at the average levels of cognitive ability for people today versus, let's say, 60 years ago, many more people would have been considered to be subnormal, if you want to put it that way, or struggling with their cognitive ability 60 years ago than are now. So cognitive abilities have been improving. You may also be interested to know that in terms of levels of violence across the world, violence has been reducing across the world for decades, centuries, as a matter of fact. And if you read the press, you would think that this weren't the case, that the world's becoming more violent. Well, in fact, on average, yes, and I know that there are wars and things, but if you go back to, let's say, the early 1800s, there were wars everywhere. So levels of violence have reduced. Now, it's theorised that one of the things that might be causing this is the Flynn effect, where levels of cognitive ability have improved, and so therefore the tendency to violence reduces. By the way, in the last few years, there's been evidence of a thing called the negative Flynn effect, where the levels of cognitive ability are now starting to drop off, and that's posited to be largely due to the fact that we are now outsourcing a whole bunch of our brain function to computers. So we don't have to do the stuff that we used to have to do. And so we're not exercising our brain so much. And yes, for the first time in human history, cognitive ability, IQ points, seem to be declining. And that's been reported widely across the world. What will be interesting to see is that if that trend continues, whether violence starts to arc back up again and we start to see more violent behaviour. Now, I just want to finish this section with something that can be considered to be a little controversial, but on the other hand, it is irrefutable, so it has that benefit. What you're seeing here is a diagram of the relationship between cognitive ability and income. And what you see is that cognitive ability correlates quite heavily with income. So this is the lowest cognitive ability, the lowest decile of cognitive ability. And this is based on many, many people, so thousands and thousands of people across the United States of America. And the highest cognitive ability is correlated with the highest income. The interesting thing about that, though, is that if you think of this in a population sense, let's say you're in an organisation that employs 10,000 people. If you think of the 10% of your workforce that's most lowly paid, you would have to presume that that's where you're going to get the bulk of your negative behaviours. Lowly paid workforces tend to have lower levels of cognitive ability. So what that will mean is that you're going to get more negative behaviours out of those workforces. And of course, this is how it plays out in practice, but it's a reason that it plays out in practice. Now, please understand, at an individual level, this does not apply. So you can have a person who has individually low cognitive ability and may be the sweetest, most harmless individual on planet Earth. And you'll get somebody who's really smart and evil. And so, yes, at an individual level, that's true. But if you get large groups of people, on average, you'll find that you get more negative behaviours. Why? Well, there is research evidence, genetic evidence, that people with higher cognitive ability have better self-management. Let's say I get angry at you. If I have higher cognitive ability, it seems that I'm better able to manage that and maybe find a sensible alternative rather than to get involved in violence. In any event, it's a strong finding from across the world. The next video is all about a thing called integrity testing, how you can screen for toxic behaviour by asking people what are called integrity questions. Now, I don't particularly like the term integrity testing. We tend to call it counterproductive work behaviour testing, but it is very effective in helping you to avoid recruiting people who have toxic behaviours. Join us for the next video to find out what it is and how it works.